When it comes to moving your deals forward quickly and winning more of them, one of the highest value things that we can do is setting really good next steps with our customers. The problem is that oftentimes the next steps that we introduce create way too much friction for our customers. They're not committed to those next steps, and sometimes when we let our customers take control of those next steps, the suggestions that they make are actually bad. Well, today we're going to demystify this whole next step process and get your next steps moving your deal in the right direction. Welcome to another episode of Sales Lab Live. I'm David Premer, excited to be back here this week to talk about this very important and quite frankly nuanced topic, because there's a lot of dimensions to next steps. Obviously, when we're running our sales cycle, we want to create next steps that move the deal in a meaningful direction, the right direction. It's something that our customers are committed to, that don't introduce too much friction. And getting that right balance is actually much more deceptively complex than you think. Now, here we're going to go. We're going to go into a couple slides here. This is what we're going to talk about today, how to set these next steps that win deals. And there's some really good data, just to kind of show you very quickly, some really good data from the folks at Gong that talk about this idea that, hey, you know what? Setting next steps and making sure we spend enough time setting those next steps on our deals is actually quite important to increasing those win rates. And when we don't spend enough time setting the next steps, which unfortunately most of us don't spend enough time doing, those close rates decrease. And in fact, some additional data, they talk about this idea that, hey, look, especially on the first meeting, so shout out to all of you SDRs out there and folks doing business development, if you don't spend enough time talking about the next steps on that first call, those deals will actually move way slower. So the more time we spend kind of talking through the next steps, making sure the customer is committed to them, the better off we'll be. Actually, at my last company, one of our best reps talked about this concept of setting next steps as getting the customer to kind of buy into what it means to say yes to our product, right? Doesn't mean that ultimately at the end of the day they are going to say yes, but for example, you wouldn't go through a whole interview process with a company not knowing what the steps to actually secure that role would be. It's not like, oh yeah, we're going to have this intro interview and then we'll see how that goes and then we'll tell you what happens after that. You wouldn't settle for that. You want to know at the outset, what does it mean to get this job? What's going to have to happen as we kind of go through the process? Now, I will say, as I kind of teased at the outset, there's a few problems that sellers often have when it comes to setting next steps. And again, these are not the exclusive problems, but these are kind of the top three things that you see a ton. First of all, they introduce way too much friction. I'm going to go through these one by one and hopefully kind of demystify these a little bit for you, right? We're asking our customers to do things, and those things might be things that they're actually not motivated to do. So they introduce too much friction in the sales cycle. Number two, we sometimes leave it up to the customer. And so we say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, we had this good conversation. What would you like to do next? And they say something that's bad, right? Something that's completely off the wall, doesn't move the deal in the right direction, that is maybe non-committal, that's bad. And then thirdly, the buyer is not committed. So even if we say, hey, look, let's set up a follow-up call, let's get your executives on the phone, and we'll send a proposal, we'll talk about this thing. Sometimes our customers ghost on us, right? Sometimes they no-show. There's a lot of challenges as they relate to getting our customers as bought in and mutually committed to the next steps as we are. So I want to just kind of talk a little bit about some of these things. Certainly, there's going to be more to dive into, and I'll point out some references that you can kind of dive into, get a little bit more context on these topics. But let's dive into this first one, first of all. What does it mean when we say that the next step that we set creates too much friction? And I kind of teased this a little bit earlier. This idea that when we set next steps with our customers, we're basically asking them to do something, right? And that doesn't mean that just because we have these things that we want them to do, that they're sufficiently motivated to do them. Imagine, for example, we went out on a nice date, right? And at the end of the date, I say, hey, the date went pretty good. What do you think next week? Why don't we get married? And then we'll kind of, we'll go off to Vegas on our honeymoon. And you're thinking to yourself, whoa, I'm not ready for this yet, David, right? You're introducing way too much friction. And of course, when I give an example like that, it sounds completely ridiculous and nonsensical. But oftentimes we unwittingly introduce way too much friction into these sales cycles with our customers. And I've actually heard, call recordings of reps where, for example, I have a rep, one of my clients says, hey, you know what, David, I don't know what's going on. I'm doing these video calls with customers. I'm sending, follow-up message afterwards. I'm thinking these calls are going pretty good. And no one's getting back to me. No one's committing to these next steps. So I said, well, can you send me some samples? Can I just listen to some of the recordings of where you're kind of positioning next steps with customers? And what he was doing in these instances was he was saying, hey, as a next step, I think it would be great for us to get on a 1-hour deep dive discovery call where I could learn a ton about your business and I could show you our solution. And that in some contexts might sound okay, but in an initial conversation with a customer or after initial conversation with a customer, that's a big commitment, especially if I haven't teased enough value. So this idea that we're actually asking sometimes too much of our customers, we're asking them to get married, and the reality is we just got off the first date, right? On the flip side, if we kind of, pull it back and don't introduce enough friction, it's like, hey, look, I'll leave the ball in your court. If you like what you see, give me a call, whenever, right? That doesn't introduce enough structure. And kind of the way I think about it, I'm a science guy, science and engineering guy by education. So I always think about things in kind of a scientific way. And if you think of, for example, your opportunity is this kind of block that we're trying to kind of push across this, we'll call it like a wooden plank. There's friction that gets created, right? There's these headwinds of the customer's current state, what they're currently doing. Maybe they have some objections. Maybe they're stated, maybe they're not. Maybe they're afraid of something. And that creates a lot of resistance to moving forward. On the flip side, they might be sufficiently motivated to change in certain ways. Like they have a certain motivation. They might have a business pain or a compelling event, as we like to say. And the real key for us is to make sure that we sufficiently motivate them to overcome that friction. Because if we don't, if that motivation is less than kind of that current state, the objections and fears, then there is no deal. They will not be moving forward, right? So our goal is to, our next steps, you say a little typo here, but the next step should overcome that opportunity friction, right? We should be asking them to do something that overcomes that friction, provides sufficient motivation, but doesn't scare them off, right? So a lot of companies, I think one of the best examples of a next step that a lot of companies will do, and I think HubSpot in particular was a good example of this, and I think they probably still do this. They have a little tool called a website grader, right? So you're interested in HubSpot for CRM and for marketing automation, all that kind of stuff. And they'll say, hey, look, you know what? We don't know what kind of position your website is currently in. Why don't you just go to our website? We have this thing called a website grader. Plunk in the URL of your company website, and we'll do this analysis on this, and we'll send it. You'll see the results right there, and you'll kind of see how you're doing. I think that's a perfect example of a next step that actually doesn't introduce too much friction, because from the customer's perspective, it kind of sounds very innocuous. Okay, yeah, this makes sense. I'm probably going to learn something for better or for worse. And it doesn't commit the customer to necessarily doing anything. Now, we do this, of course, a lot in the technology space. We might, suggest some kind of proof of concept, or hey, watch this demo online, or something that doesn't introduce too much friction, but helps, in my vernacular, it helps cut the customer a little bit. It helps helps deepen the pain that they're experiencing, that maybe in your discovery conversation you kind of talked a little bit about, but you want to suggest a next step that helps maybe deepen that pain. So I think something like a website grader, a tool, an analysis is very helpful in that regard, because it doesn't introduce too much friction. When it comes to friction, I'm always also a fan of what I refer to and what is referred to as interest-based calls to action. Now, I actually did a whole other Sales Lab Live on this content about calls to action. So if you want to check this out, if you're here in the Sales Lab, you can check it out at the top of the page on the featured area. Find this. If you're happening to watch this on YouTube, you can find this video on my YouTube channel. Just look for this thumbnail. But the idea here is that there are calls to action, and I would kind of lump a next step into that kind of category of call to action that sometimes scares customers away, like when I propose, getting married. But what the folks at Gong found was that when I asked, rather than for a specific call to action, hey, as a next step, why don't we meet next Thursday at 2 p.m. and I'll take you through A, B, and C, what they talk about are interest-based calls to action, which is to say, hey, we had this good conversation. It sounds like there could be some value here. Would you be, as a next step, would you be interested in exploring this a little further? Or is there interest in having a conversation, a deeper conversation about this? So you're actually not necessarily committing to kind of that detailed next step in terms of dates and times and all those kinds of things, but rather all you're committing to is being interested. And people are much more likely to say, yes, I am interested, and then we can kind of, form the next step from there. So that's my advice when you're trying to create those next steps. Try to make sure that you are not introducing too much friction, that the next step you're actually adding, you're kind of putting in place for the customer is adding value, maybe deepening their pain a bit, maybe focus more on kind of like the interest. Are you interested in moving forward? Because if you are, we can do A, B, and C. Put it back in the customer's court and let them move towards you. So I really want you to think about this, like what can we do to not introduce an undue amount of friction in our next steps to the point where it actually scares the customer off. So tricky to strike that balance, but hopefully that gives you some ideas. Now, the next problem that we often find with next steps is that their suggestions are bad, right? So imagine this, right? I get off the phone with a customer and we're talking about, hey, we have this product and the service and like we can help you do A, B, and C. And the customer says, great, can you just send me some information, or can you send me a proposal, or can you send me some pricing? Do we want to do that? No, we don't want to do it. Because when we just send things over, we lose control of the sales cycle. And so what happens is sometimes when we kind of put the suggestion, the opportunity back to our customers to set that next step or to suggest what they'd like to do, sometimes their suggestions are bad. And so what we want to do in this instance is, first of all, kind of have this vision going into the call. What do we want? Like, what would a good next step be? Like, what would we want that good next step to be? And for example, you can think about, as I'm going to just show you here, you can think about next steps in terms of a bunch of different outcomes. Like, as a next step, is it just a matter of like, you're just going to sign the thing? Because this is like a very quick upsell opportunity. Do we want to push you to a secondary discovery call? Maybe I'm an SDR doing that kind of that initial qualification. As the next step, I'd really love to hook you up with one of our account reps, a solution specialist to go a little bit deeper. Maybe as a next step, I need some information from you to conduct that free assessment. Maybe, for example, that website grader tool from HubSpot that we talked about. Maybe I want to do a bit of analysis. Maybe I want to do a little bit of a business case or ROI, right? And so I want to have a sense of what that outcome is going to be. And you see the little prescription bottles there. What I mean by that is once we figure out what that next step we want it to be, what we want to try to do is we want to try to be a little bit prescriptive with our customers, meaning we want to kind of direct them in the direction of a next step that's actually going to be very helpful, but kind of moves away maybe from some of the next steps they might suggest, which are just kind of very high level and really don't do anything for the deal. And I actually talk about this concept in a little more detail. If you want to check it out, this is an article on my blog, Leading Your Customer Through the Buying Process, and 3 different ways that you can be prescriptive, meaning how you can lead your customer through that buying process. And one of the ways is setting really good prescriptive next steps. And when you have a situation where you say to the customer, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, what would you like as a next step? Because taking a step back for a second, one of the best reps I work with, she did this all the time. She would often ask the customers, okay, we had this call, we had this meeting, whatever it was, went pretty good. What would you like to do as a next step? Now, here's kind of the beauty of that tactic. If the customer actually says something better than what you had in mind, right? Like, oh, this actually sounds really good. Can we get our executive team on a call? I think it's really important for them to see this. And you're saying to yourself, sure, that would be awesome, right? It was better than probably what I was going to suggest, which might have been a lower friction next step. But if, for example, the customer kind of comes back and says something that's bad, for example, they say, yeah, as a next step, I'd love for you to kind of send some pricing and proposals over and so on, right? One of the things and that's a bad next step. We don't want to agree to that, right? And that's actually one of the problems is that oftentimes as sellers, we will sometimes agree to those things. We can take a step back and say, hey, you know what? And we can reframe. So for example, I've heard some really good calls from reps and SDRs who would say things like, hey, customer says, as the next step, yeah, send me a proposal, send me some information. And the rep says, hey, look, I'm happy to help, and I want to get you the information you need. This is what I often refer to as kind of the acknowledging and softening in my objection handling curriculum. Totally understand. I want to help you get what you need. If you don't mind me asking or saying, typically in these instances, when a customer asks me to send them information and then I send the information over, like 95% of the time, I never hear from this customer again. And, then I have to follow up, and then you start not liking me because I'm following up. And that's the last thing I think we want in terms of our relationship here. So by the way, like you can also add, if you're asking to, have me send information, if you kind of sense this, send information because you kind of really want to tell me no. and you don't have the heart to tell me, that's okay. Like, you can tell me no, right? And we've talked about this as well on my channel and my content. Sometimes when you give your customers permission to say no, it becomes more likely in the end that they say yes. So the take-home message here is that if you ever get stuck with a bad next step on behalf of your customer, it is okay to push back. This is actually sometimes what I refer to as kind of the kindergarten class rules approach. And I don't know if you remember back to your kindergarten days, or if you have kids in kindergarten, you come to the kindergarten and the teacher says, hey class, we should come up with some rules for how we should behave in class. Don't you agree, kids? Okay. I'm going to go to the board, and the teacher has a marker and says, what do you think some rules of our class should be? And one kid says, I think we should share our toys with our friends. I'm like, of course, that is a great rule. And I start writing, that down on the board. And then another kid says, I think we should hit each other and eat cookies every day. Now, of course, the teacher's not going to write that on the board because that's a bad suggestion. So what do? They kind of take a step back and say, I don't know if that's such a good suggestion. That's not the way we treat each other. So you're basically reframing. So this is a really good approach for you. If you ever find yourself in that situation where your customers are actually giving you bad advice, you can reframe their next steps, but my advice to you is, to the extent that you can, go in and be prescriptive about what those next steps should be. And one of the ways that you can actually bring up those next steps in a fun, prescriptive way is to use a phrase. Now, this is kind of, I'm going to get a little bit cerebral on you here, which I love to do. One of the phrases, which if you follow me at all, I absolutely hate and never use, is the phrase, does this make sense? Does that make sense? Because it can be construed in two negative ways. One, which is kind of like patronizing, like, does this make sense? Because I'm pretty smart and I think you're pretty dumb and I don't think you're getting any of the stuff that I'm putting down to you. Or it can be used in kind of like this self-deprecating way, like, does this make sense? Because I'm not really good at explaining things, and sometimes the things I say leave people with a sense of bewilderment. And I'm giving you this, because sometimes, quite often, people claim that when they have this phrase used on them, they report being strangely put off by it. In fact, I have an entire video, I talk about this in my book, but I have an entire video on my YouTube channel about it. If you want to find this thumbnail, check it out. Don't use this phrase. However, there is an exception to this rule, which is when this phrase is used as a proposition, as a suggestion. And it's really interesting. Again, this is some data from the folks at Gong again that talk about the fact that when this phrase is actually used as a suggestion, the close rates actually increase. So for example, I might say, as a next, the call went, really well. It sounds like there's a there. As a next step, do you think it would make sense for us to maybe reconvene in a week or so? We can kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive. I can learn a little bit more about your business. I'm happy to show you our product, and then we can decide whether or not, it makes sense to continue from there. So again, an interest-based call to action. I'm using does that make sense as a suggestion, not as a kind of a clarification. I'm using it as a suggestion. So it's what Chris Voss would refer to as a tactical use of the phrase, does that make sense? And I'm basically proposing a suggestion for you to say yes or no to. So rather than take the next step and force it on you, I'm making my suggestion something that you can either say yes or no to. And when you say yes or no to that suggestion, you are going to be automatically much more committed to it, which actually brings us to our last piece here, this idea that when we propose next steps to our customers, oftentimes they are not committed to those next steps. They are not committed to the same extent that we are as it relates to those next steps. And so the question is, how do we get our customers more committed? Well, of course, one of the ways is to make sure that we're actually setting good next steps, that they've agreed to, that don't introduce too much friction, that we kind of propose and they say kind of yes or no. So those are kind of ways of driving that agreement in a way that's kind of very natural. But one of the things that you can also do is use questions in a way to kind of drive commitment, to make sure that those customers actually show up to those next steps. So I'll give you this really interesting example here. This is a study that was done in the New York Times a little while back. This is probably in the late 90s. And it talked about a restaurant in Chicago that had a problem with no-shows, like people booking reservations and then not showing up. And what they found was when they were asking those customers, those patrons, to kind of, after they booked their reservation, to confirm things, what they were saying was like, hey, look, please call us if your plans change, right? Please call. It was like basically a request. And the no-show rate there was actually 30%. So 30% of people were actually not showing up. And so what did they do? They were able to dramatically reduce their no-show rates by simply changing the statement to a question. So what did they do? They said, instead of please call us if you change your plans, will you call us if you change your plans? And this may be another Sales Lab Live. We'll get deeper into this. Will you call us if you change your plans? And what they found was the no-show rate drops to 10%. And what's the magic here? Why does this work? Well, when we ask people questions and they are forced to answer them, and in this case, say, hey, look, for example, you might say to a customer as a next step, would it make sense to have a call or would you bring in your executive team, whatever it is, and they say yes, and you say great. So, then you can come back to them and say, hey, look, so let's schedule, I'm going to send you an invite. Question for you, David. If for whatever reason you can't make this meeting, or between now and then you have second thoughts and you're just not feeling it, will you reach out to me and let me know? Pause, wait for the answer. And what happens is when they respond, and hopefully they respond affirmatively, most people do, and say, oh yeah, of course I will. What happens is just a psychological principle known as cognitive dissonance. And what happens is with cognitive dissonance, it's a principle that says that people need to behave in a manner that is consistent with their public beliefs and stated opinions. And so when I tell you that, yes, I will call you if my plans change, and my plans change and I don't call you, what happens is I experience this kind of inner turmoil, right? You start to kind of have a bit of a mild identity crisis. And so when I ask you to confirm, yes, will you call me if your plans change? You say yes, you are automatically much more committed to it, to the extent where, either you'll show up, or if there's an issue, you're going to reach out and call me. Even if you say, hey, look, if you're not feeling this anytime, will you please let me know? Even throughout the entire sales cycle, I want you to know you're not going to be hurting my feelings. So we covered a lot of ground here today as far as next steps go. We talked about this idea that, hey, look, sometimes we introduce too much friction. The key is to find that right balance of something that moves your deal forward, something your customer is mutually committed to, but doesn't introduce way too much friction where all of a sudden you are scaring them off. We talked about how sometimes, we want to take our customer suggestions because it means they're going to be more committed to them. But sometimes we need to be prescriptive. We need to make those suggestions that they can commit to so they don't send us next steps and suggestions that are out of whack, that don't move our deal forward. And certainly if you get one of those suggestions, you can put the kibosh on it. You can absolutely reframe like the kindergarten teacher approach and reframe that next step to be something that is more in line, that's something that you feel would actually move your deal forward. And then finally, if you want to drive an increased level of commitment, and this works outside of the realm of next steps as well, get your customers to publicly commit to those next steps, verbally to you, and or in email, basically saying like, yes, I will call you if my plans change. Yes, I'm committed to this next step. Get them to agree, because even if it seems relatively minor, it gets them emotionally bought in. So those are my next steps tips for today. I hope you enjoyed this session of Sales Lab Live, and we'll see you again on the next one.